I was recently asked in a comment on one of our community posts.
If you think employers are paying Gen Z dogshit wages, what is a reasonable amount you think they should be earning for minimum wage on an entry-level job?
I actually thought this was a fair question to ask, as if we want to push for change, we should clarify what exactly it is we want. So I took a long time to think of what a reasonable, starting minimum wage would be. And after a lot of careful analysis and research, I came up with the figure of $36.41 per hour. Now, delusional boomers watching this are probably scoffing and laughing in their typical, condescending, delusional boomer attitude. But, as you'll soon see, this figure actually comes from real statistics based on standards and expectations set by boomers themselves. So, if they think this is ridiculous, that just means they think their own logic is ridiculous, to which I wouldn't argue against that at all. You see, boomers are the ones who set the cultural expectations for us to move out at 18, get a job, and start paying for rent by ourselves. They're the ones constantly hardcore pressuring us to move out and pay rent even in the face of this absurd rental market. So, if they want us to move and be able to afford to pay rent, then it only makes sense that they pay us enough for us to be able to afford paying rent. Especially because they're the ones primarily in charge of both the rental and job markets right now. So, since young people are not only expected to, but hardcore pressured and shamed by their asshole boomer parents into paying our own rent, it's more than fair that we demand high enough wages to be able to pay for our own rent. Again, this is based on their expectations for us, and not our own. So when you take all this into account, coming up with an answer to how much Gen Z should be getting paid for minimum wage, entry-level jobs is very simple. It all boils down to how much you would have to make in order to be able to afford paying rent. How much would that be? Let's find out. In order to get a fair and objective answer, I'm not going to base this off my own opinion or experiences. I'm going to base this off official statistics and recommendations from boomers themselves. According to Landlord Studio, as a general rule of thumb, landlords should aim for a rent-to-income ratio of no more than 30%, meaning the tenant should earn at least 3 times the rent amount. A higher rent-to-income ratio means the tenant will have less money to live off, and should they come under hard times, they may have to sacrifice paying for certain essentials to continue covering living expenses. With rent taking so much of their paycheck, it is often the first payment that is sacrificed. Landlord Studio is a property management and accounting software designed for landlords. And let's be honest here, most landlords are boomers or older Gen X. It's not many Gen Z and millennial landlords out there. So, according to sources designed for boomers themselves, you should be making at least 3.3 times the cost of rent to even be considered as a suitable tenant who can reliably afford to pay rent. So if boomers want you to move out and be able to afford paying rent, and they themselves set the standard of a suitable tenant at 3.3 times the cost of rent, it only makes sense they pay you a minimum wage that's 3.3 times the cost of rent. And yes, the minimum wage. Because they don't say you should move out and pay rent at 25 after you've had some time to build career experience. They say you should move out at 18 when all you realistically can get is a minimum wage job. Once again, I want to reiterate that all these statistics I came up with are according to official sources from boomers themselves, not from biased Gen Z or millennials who just want to get paid more. So based on boomer logic itself, to find out what minimum wage should be for Gen Z, all you have to do is multiply the average rent price across America of $1,748 by the 3.3 times that boomer landlords want you to make before they consider you a suitable tenant, and you get a total lump sum of $5,768 per month. Once you divide that by 40 hours worked per week, or 160 hours per month, you get a total of $36 per hour and some change. This is how much it costs to be able to afford rent in America. And to be honest, I'd imagine you'd get a similar number in most Western countries right now as well. And once again, none of this is my own personal opinion. These are all facts and statistics coming from boomer sources themselves. So, look, this is just basic math and logic at this point. If I want to buy a sandwich that costs $5, guess what? I have to pay $5. If I want to buy a PS5, that costs $500, guess what? I have to pay $500. If I want to buy a car that costs $50,000, guess what? I have to pay $50,000. So, if you want someone to move out and live on their own, and it costs $36 per hour to be able to afford to live on your own now, according to landlords themselves, then guess what? You have to pay them $36 per hour. I get that boomers struggle with basic math and logic, but it shouldn't be that hard to figure this out. If you think this number is too high, you can either drop rent prices or drop this stupid, outdated cultural expectation to move out at 18. But again, these are all prices and expectations that you yourself set. Beyond this, however, there's another very interesting and historical metric we can use to gauge what the minimum wage should be. And interestingly enough, it comes out to a very similar number. You see, you'll often hear boomers telling you that you just need to work harder. I was only making $5 per hour at my first job, too. What they won't tell you, however, was that rent only cost $71 per month back then. I mean, I swear boomers are literally too delusional to even understand what inflation is at this point. But anyways, if you were to take the average rent of $71 back in the 60s and divide it by the minimum wage of $1.60 back then, you get a total of around 44, meaning rent cost about 44 times the minimum hourly wage back then. An easier way to think of this would be you had to work around 44 hours total to pay for a month's worth of rent. So let's do the exact same math for today. If you were to divide the average rent today of $1,748 by the same exact 44 hours of work, you come out with a figure of $39, which is almost the exact same as our $36 calculation earlier in the video. This is what minimum wage would have been today if it had just kept pace with the same purchasing power boomers had in the 60s. The sheer irony in all this is that boomers would laugh and sneer at you in their typical condescending boomer fashion if you brought up the idea of a $39 minimum wage, all while not realizing that that's literally the equivalent of what they themselves made when they were our age. To be honest, I would say that it wouldn't even be entitled if we demanded an even higher minimum wage than that. When you consider throughout history, most parents built a better future for their children. But at the very least, we should be entitled to the same conditions our parents had. This is what's so despicable about that generation. With the absolute economic silver platter they were handed, they didn't even have to improve anything. If they just kept things the way they were, without royally screwing up, then everything would still be great today. But of course, they had to royally screw everything up and blame us for not fixing their own mess that they created before we were even born. Now, this isn't meant to be a political video about the economics of minimum wage itself. This is just about holding delusional boomers to their own delusional standards. But I get that anytime you talk about the minimum wage in any context, this debate is bound to surface, so let's take a moment to address it. Minimum wage is a very heated and polarizing topic. You got some claiming it should be even higher, and others claiming it shouldn't exist at all, because businesses and workers should have the freedom to negotiate whatever wage they choose. But here's the problem. The point of a job is to make enough to live off of. There's a reason they call it earning a living. And this is where, if you're a free market capitalist, you can't have it both ways. You have to live by your own free market principles. This tweet right here put it perfectly. I don't get the argument that employers can't afford to pay $15 per hour. That's the value of labor. If I can't afford a Porsche, then I can't get a Porsche. I don't get to demand a discount on Porsche. If businesses can't afford labor, that's on the business, not the labor market. It always struck me as odd how we're such a free market, supply and demand, capitalist society where everyone has to earn every dollar they make and no one is entitled to anything. But when it comes to defending corporations, no one bats an eye at how entitled they are when it comes to labor. Expecting people to work for $7, $10, $15 or whatever an hour right now, when it's clearly not enough to pay for these absurd rent costs, is literally the epitome of entitlement. If the average person can't afford to pay their rent, this soulless, brainwashed society we live in has no problem calling them a loser and saying that they're not entitled to basic human needs like food and shelter, and that they deserve to be evicted and kicked out onto the street. I personally disagree with this, but if that's your logic, then we need to apply it equally to corporations as we do to people. If corporations can't afford to pay you enough to pay your rent, then that corporation is a loser corporation. And just like you would collapse and go homeless if you couldn't afford to pay rent, they should absolutely deserve to collapse and go out of business if they can't afford to pay people enough to make a living.